feel like you're going to be more prepared than I am, but whatever. Let's dive into...
I have spent about the last 7 or 8 years having this argument with people.
Yeah. So you
We'll
said
see.
you didn't prepare, but I think I'm going to be outmatched, but I'm going to put up a good fight.
We'll see.
Episode... I don't know what episode we're on anymore.
This is episode 9.
Dang.
And we are today on the Kibbe on Liberty set because we just finished filming with an episode with Father Sirico from the Acton Institute.
Yeah, I'm one of his... I follow him quite closely, so I was pretty excited about that interview.
I thought it was really good. I'm excited for it to come out. It's nice to get someone of such learning and wisdom on the show to kind of counterbalance Kibbe's learning and wisdom.
Yeah, and he has the perfect speaking voice, too, which is kind of one of my selling
Very
points.
good radio voice, very deep and resonant.
Brooklyn accent.
Yeah, definitely.
So...
You wanted to talk about something today.
Yeah, I want to have a debate. I want to hash something out with you.
Let's do it.
I'm a little nervous. I feel like you're going to be maybe intellectually overpower me, so I did a little prep, but I'm going to give it all I got.
All right, what do you want to talk about?
I want to talk about anarchy.
Excellent.
And not the anarchy that you see talking about on Fox News.
Yeah.
The idea probably came from Murray Rothbard. I forgot what he wrote an article once about the more capitalist a society becomes, the more anarchy there is in the society.
Well, I mean, the original term comes from kind of early communists, actually. So, who wanted the state to disappear and everybody to live in cooperation with each other. But the way I use it, full disclosure, I'm an anarchist. I'm a libertarian anarchist. That's what I call myself. And the way I use it is just the idea that I want human interaction to be as cooperative and as uncoerced as possible, as voluntary as possible. Some people call it voluntarism, which is a decent term, but I like anarchy better. It's got a good Greek root there. It just means no rulers in Greek. And I just think people should interact with each other on a voluntary basis and that coercion in society should be minimal. And that's what I mean by that.
Yeah, and so I'm going to argue against that. I don't think this idea of a stateless society is feasible, possible, realistic. And I'm very curious to hear your argument for. I'm going to pepper you with some questions. But before we start, let's dive into the libations.
What did you bring today?
So I found this and was sold by the liquor store attendant. Dr. Stoner's Smoky Herb Whiskey. Made by a local guy out where I live who, I don't know if this is probably make it sound even worse. He was a dentist.
Okay.
Now he brews liquor down in Virginia Beach, not in Winchester, Virginia, out near where I live. But I grabbed it on an impulse, but Matt so kindly didn't have much faith in what I had purchased here.
The fact that he's a dentist makes me think it's going to taste like mouthwash.
I know, that's the expectations I immediately had. I was like, oh, I don't know now. But I was at the register, and I was I'm going to wait for you. Give yourself a pour, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Sorry, work around the mics.
Yep.
I feel more important now that we got upgraded for an episode to Kibbe set up.
Don't want to pour myself too much of that to start off with.
He gave us a spit bucket,
it's nice
too.
and cold,
That's
though.
an exact quote. I left it in my car.
That's an unusual smell.
Oh, yeah, that's very herby.
It's weird.
It almost has the dentist taste.
Yeah. It's got a sweetness to it. It's very strange.
It has a sweetness. Is it right away? I'm going to take another sip.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe I'll save that bottle for my friends I don't like very much. It's not bad, but it's just very unique.
Yeah. I don't think I'd want to drink a lot of it.
No, maybe a mixed drink?
Maybe.
Wow.
I could see like an old-fashioned made with that might not be bad.
I almost brought supplies for an old-fashioned, but then I just couldn't figure out the ice melting, so I was like, forget it. Too much work. But eventually, we're going to take a break. We're going to go back to some real bourbon because I can't not drink on this show.
Okay, fair enough.
But, so, I guess let's start with a very simple question. The idea of a stateless society or no government. For my first objection, I don't see, I can't find in history where this has ever occurred on at least somewhat of a moderately large scale. So the fact that I have no past data point to like base around this idea, I love the idea of anarchy. Like the philosophy of it, it's very appealing of people just cooperating, private agreements, no man with a gun technically telling you how to live your life.
Right.
Which is the state. It's a monopoly on violence. But I also can't point to any time in history where that to get started. I can't find like, oh, they did it so great back in ancient.
There are a couple examples people like to cite that are kind of partial examples. They're not really, perfect anarchy or anything. But medieval Iceland and medieval Ireland both had kind of a privatized law enforcement setup, a privatized justice setup that kind of slightly resembles what I'm talking about. It did have kind of tribal chieftains and things like that. So it wasn't entirely anarchic in that sense. There is some sort of a hierarchy, which is always going to be a hierarchy. But in terms of institutionalized like taxation or any kind of monopoly on force, it was much more community based. So those are a couple of societies where they've had something similar. But I mean, the history of humankind is the history of oppression and the history of being, told what to do by some powerful group. And there's not a lot of examples of it. But I think part of the reason for that is I think that a stateless society becomes easier the more advanced technology is. Because part of the problem is being able to hold people accountable for what they do and make sure con men aren't coming around and stealing all your stuff. And we have the internet now, so we can get information about any kind of business. We have Yelp reviews. We have things like that. It's a lot easier if someone's trying to rip you off, trying to do a bad job, you can go on the internet and say, hey, this company tried to rip me off. Don't do business with them. And you can easily find that information. And it rewards honesty and punishes dishonesty a lot more directly and in a community-based sense than just having a centralized law enforcement group try to do it. So I think it becomes easier as communication gets better and as knowledge gets better. But you're right that there haven't been any pure examples of it. I don't know if that's necessarily an argument against it, that it couldn't work. But, there's lots of things that haven't existed in the past that we have now that work just fine.
Yeah, and then that is a good point. So that's just my first way to cast doubt on your argument of the possibility of anarchy. Another thing that also worries me, like one, I feel like what I would argue against anarchy is that the human condition, maybe it's so imprinted in us, is for a state. So I feel like even if we got to a point of a stateless society, eventually a state that had some monopoly on force would emerge that you couldn't exit from. And I guess an example kind of now, I feel like human condition is like, I'm always weary of like the ideologue. Like I would just like to live uninterrupted in my life how I see fit. But there's always an ideologue that might even align with me philosophically, but he's got such a plan for society. Yeah, that person would eventually emerge as a despot. So I think like even with like Obama was in power, the reaction to Obama was Donald Trump. And you talk to any conservative, they're going to fancy themselves the voice of freedom and Donald Trump's going to make us free, which is absurd in my mind. It's just the new man up that's going to emerge as the new despot essentially. Now it's I'm going to get a lot of flack for that from all my conservative friends for calling Donald Trump a despot, but it's the whole system as a whole. I kind of see that if we ever got to a stateless society or if there was some form of a revolution, and I think most revolutions fail anyways. Agreed. And get turned into worse situations. But let's just say we had a really good revolution. Let's just say the American Revolution. You could argue against that being that great either with all the things that happened in it. But eventually the elites would assume power in a way in my mind. Like, is there any way to stop? I feel like we need a state to protect. We need a minimal state to protect some objective truths and rights and dignity.
I have many things to say about that, and hopefully I can remember all of them. I want to start by just saying that my inclination towards anarchy is totally a moral one rather than a practical one. From an ethical point of view, I can't see a justification for institutionalized theft, which is taxation, for a monopoly on force, for this one group of people to have all the political power and to decide how things are going to be done, and to extract money from people, the product of their labor, without their consent in order to make it done. I can't morally justify that. I think if I'm not allowed to steal from you, no one should be allowed to steal from you. Just because someone has a badge or has a tax collector ID or something, I don't think they should be allowed to do that. I think it's morally wrong, and that's why I oppose it. I also think it would be an improvement on the status quo. I don't think it would be utopian. A lot of people think if you can poke one hole in anarchy, then you can say, it wouldn't work. It wouldn't be utopian. It's not a utopian philosophy. It's an improvement on what we have now. And I think it would be slightly better. But even if I didn't think that, even if I thought it would be a disaster, I would still be an anarchist because I think it's the morally correct thing to do. Now, you talked about elites reemerging and a government coming back together afterwards. And this is something that Murray Rothbard addressed. And he said, it's possible that would happen, but at least the world would have had a glorious holiday, which was his phrase, which I always like. It could happen. And it's the kind of thing that I think people have to want. I'm not in favor of revolution. I think revolution doesn't work in general. I think the American Revolution worked pretty well, but that's an outlier. Revolution doesn't work very well. I think evolution into this sort of society is what you need, and it's not going to work unless people want it. So it's a changing hearts and minds kind of thing on my part. People have to want to make it work, or else it's not going to work. So you can't bring it about by force, and there's always a chance that it'll slide back into a state, but I think that would be unfortunate, and I think that it would be better to have a little period of time without it than to, not have it, than to constantly have a state through the entire existence, because then people can see what's better. If we try it out and it doesn't work, then people can say, oh, let's go back to having a state. If we try it out and it does work, then we can keep doing it.
The other, I want to, I guess, kind of make a statement. I feel, well, one, I feel like voices like yourselves, I think of the friend of, the Free the People, Jeffrey Tucker. He fancies himself an anarchist. I think those are very important. I think Hayek advocated at one point for, so we need to almost sell a utopian version of liberty. And yeah, it's not really true. There's no such thing as a utopian version of liberty that we could ever reach to, but it'll help pull the box, I guess, as it was, closer to where we need it to be to have liberty.
Right. I think it's a mistake, because I don't think you should misrepresent what you're selling as utopian, because then if someone finds a hole in it, they think that they got you.
Yes.
And they're like, oh, well, you said everything would be perfect, but here's
the left does a great job of keep selling their leftist utopian.
Like, no, it's
people
not going to
keep
be
buying.
perfect. There's going to be problems. There's going to be poverty. There's going to be con men. There's going to be crime. But I think that in the whole, there would be less crime, because people right now, they say, when they look at the level of crime, you don't include the government in that. You don't include all the people they kill in war. You don't include the people the police kill. You don't include the theft that goes on in terms of taxation and fines, all the lost revenue and stuff that happens from licensing and regulations on business. None of that is counted as a crime rate. So people say, oh, there might be a higher crime rate under anarchy. Well, almost certainly not, because all that crime that the government's committing, which is not technically crime because they've said it's legal, that wouldn't exist anymore. So you might get a little bit more private crime, but the overall level of injustice in society would go down, in my opinion.
So just how you're measuring crime.
Right.
But if you measure it by counting all the injustice of government, we have a ton of crime, and that would all be reduced.
Yeah.
Now,
look at what all the kidnapping government does.
They do a lot of kidnapping.
I consider people being locked up for nonviolent offenses. That's kidnapping. They're taking you and putting you in a cell and saying you can't leave. There's no difference.
The other, one of my biggest, as a Catholic, practicing Catholic, big objections to the idea of anarchy, when I think it over, is that if everyone engaged in private interactions we would have a hard time as a society settling on an objective truth. And I fundamentally believed in objective truth. So you would have your private police force that would help enforce your subjective truth, and so on and so forth. And maybe there will be communities that set rules, right? There's always going to be rules. There's even outside of government.
Certainly.
But those rules could shift, and that's fine. I think rules should shift, but that also, I wonder, outside of like a society accepting a true objective truth, don't kill people.
Right.
If that could be voted on, I feel like there would just be, it wouldn't work. Eventually the state would reemerge.
Maybe. I mean, like, I'm thinking of something like the Amish community, which doesn't really have a government per se. They pretty much live in a state of anarchy, and they have their accepted norms that are centered around their culture and their faith and their theology and everything. And, you would have separate communities. Like it wouldn't be, you wouldn't have a country like the United States with 350 million people. You'd have little communities of people who share similar values. And maybe the idea that you get a community that thinks it's okay to kill people, I think it's unrealistic. I don't think it's likely that that's going to happen, because every society in human history has had prohibitions on killing people, because we realize how, destructive it is to society, and it's just counterproductive. But, it would certainly be a tiny minority compared to the groups that set up their own norms and mores.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's some.
I mean, one of the points I like to make is everybody hates monopoly. Yeah. Everyone, like the left hates when a company has a monopoly on something. They say there's too much corporate power. The right hates when the government has monopoly on something like the post office. They say it's inefficient and doesn't work. But everyone makes an exception for things like police and courts and military. And they say, oh, well, that's good that the government has a monopoly on that. And to my mind, it hasn't been demonstrated conclusively why those monopolies are okay and other monopolies are bad. It seems like people just arbitrarily accept those things and say, well, that's all right. There's this idea of public goods, but I don't find that argument very persuasive.
Yeah. And if
competition makes everything better and cheaper, why doesn't it make those things better and cheaper too?
Yeah. We 100%, for some reason I don't understand it, accept government as we're just comfortable with that monopoly that they have, and everyone rails against monopoly all the time. I'm not necessarily against a natural monopoly, although one's never happened. It's just
Right. Not for any period of time anyway.
it's just a blackboard economics essentially. There could be a natural monopoly, but we both left and right we're comfortable with the monopoly of government so long as our guys in power.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. In your mind, do you think? Yeah, I just don't see how. Eventually, people would organize into a way that would form a state.
They might. I can't say they wouldn't.
Yeah.
This is something that I think is really important. My kind of main point to get across is that I don't know what would happen. And I have people asking me about this all the time. And they always say, well, who would build the roads? How would law enforcement work? How would this work? How would that work? How is this going to get taken care of? And it's not a very satisfying answer to say, I don't know, because they're like, oh, you haven't thought it through. But the whole point of it is that I don't know. If I did know, if I knew how all those things would work in the best way possible, then I wouldn't be advocating for anarchy. I'd be advocating for myself to be king, and I would just set everything up, and then it would work great. But the whole point of it is that one person is never going to have as much creativity or knowledge or ingenuity as a society of thousands or millions of people. And so by opening it up and letting people solve these problems on their own, you're going to get solutions that I've never thought of and that you've never thought of to these problems. And I guess it's a leap of faith, but I think that, you're going to get better, more interesting, more creative solutions to problems if you let everybody try to solve them than if you just put someone in charge and say, you solve all these problems, figure it out. Here's a panel of 5 Harvard professors.
Yeah.
I just don't think that works as well. But it's not, I don't have the answers to all these questions, because that's why I think that we should open it up to a more democratic solution and devolve political power to, I think a real problem that happens in society is when you have an imbalance of political power. When you have too few people with too much power, oppression always results. So the idea behind anarchy is to try to spread out that political power to as many people as possible, so that people are kind of in charge of their own lives and maybe their families or maybe their neighborhoods, but nobody's in charge of everybody else.
Now, when you say democratic power, I know like Kibbe fancies himself, like he says he loves democracy,
Right.
Everyone votes. But when you say democratic power, you don't mean running to the ballot box to vote.
No.
But democracy is, and I vote on what decision. It's every time I make a decision, it's a vote.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, democracy in the sense of having the freedom to choose things and not being dictated to by other people, and by having lots of different voices in the process and everybody kind of coming up with their own solutions. That's how Kibbe uses the word, and that's how I'm using the word here. Everyone says how great voting is, and voting is fine as far as it goes, but you always end up getting a tiny majority imposing their will on the tiny minority. So you get the 51% imposing their will on the 49%, and that doesn't seem like a good way to govern to me. It seems like kind of there's this Dr. Seuss story, which I can't remember which book it's in, but I always think about it. And it's got the king of the cats. And he says, I'm the king of the cats. You should, it's unjust and wrong that my tail should drag on the ground. I'm going to hire someone to hold up my tail so that I, will feel important. And then the person who's holding up his tail is like, well, now my tail's dragging on the ground. I'm holding up the king's tail. I'm important. Someone should hold up my tail. And it goes through the whole society where every cat is holding up the cat in front of him's tail. And then the guy at the end, the very last one, is like, well, this is everyone. I'm having to do all this work. No one's helping me out. I'm going to throw down the tail. And at the end, everyone decides to hold up their own tails. We're all going to hold up our own tails. And I think that's kind of a better metaphor for how society should work than having this strict hierarchy where everyone just serves the person above them. And I don't know. I always like that story as kind of a metaphor for anarchy. Everybody hold up your own tail.
I think the counterpoint to that story, I like that story. Now I'm going to go find that book. I have a lot of Dr. Seuss books.
It might be
around
in
my
Fox
house.
and Socks, but I can't remember.
I'll have to go look. But that almost comes across to me, though, as a very individualistic story. And we
Certainly.
just had Father Sirico on, how he was defining the person is like, yes, we are individuals, but we're also communal creatures. And I feel like someone who really wanted to pick apart that story, or at least what I immediately hits on, is like, so everyone just has to do the old pull themselves by the bootstraps. And I think that's the biggest argument why someone who's drawn to like leftist statism is against the right.
Right.
Oh, you guys are rugged, you don't care about people.
I'll clarify that what I mean by that is not about bootstrapping and, being completely financially responsible for yourself. It's more about responsibility in terms of managing your own life and making your own decisions. Because obviously some people are in disadvantaged situations. Some people need help. And I think that they should be helped. We should help them. People should help them. But I don't think you help them by forcing people to help them. I think you need to foster a culture where, we care about each other and we try to help each other out of charity and generosity. I'm a big. Have you ever read the book or seen the movie A Clockwork Orange?
I have not.
It's a great moral in that movie is that goodness can't be coerced. Goodness has to come from within. If you're deprived the choice between good and evil, you're not making a choice for good. If you're forced to choose good, you're not choosing good. There's no moral value to it anymore. And so I think that's really important to remember as well, is that the left likes to think that if the government imposes charity on people, then they're going to be charitable. But that's not charity. That's just force. That's just, coercion. And real charity comes from within. And I think that's something we should be working harder on trying to foster. And then a lot of people use it as an excuse. They say, well, I would help out, but they're already on welfare. They're already getting government aid. I don't need to do it. Someone else is taking care of it. If that wasn't there, people would feel a lot more responsibility to do it themselves because they know if I don't do it, no one else is going to.
Yeah, well, yeah, the growth of the state, I'm going to do two tangents there because you really hit home with me.
Yeah.
The growth of the state, as the state takes on more responsibilities that lower orders should have, like family, community, church, whatever it is, it erodes those communities. Because to your welfare point, if I look around well, the government will mail them a check, I get to abdicate some responsibilities to the community that I used to have. Like when someone's barn burned down, the Amish probably still do this, the whole community comes together and rebuilds the barn. Yeah. Now you're just they'll get a check. The other thing,
insurance will cover it.
Insurance will cover it. So we suddenly don't care anymore about our neighbor because someone else has stepped in and taken over responsibility that used to be in the hands of the community. The other point you hit on there was how the left likes to coerce the good. And if you coerce, you remove the virtue or the morality of that good decision. The right's doing that too now. And people that I agree with morally, this is how we should function in society. There's this new common good capitalism, which I was kind of talking to Father about before that recording, where they literally think we'll just use the state to force what I agree with is the right decision. But as soon as you coerce someone, you've eliminated the virtue of that decision. It's no longer a virtuous
decision.
Morality
can't exist without choice.
Yeah, so it's the right is just as susceptible, and it's becoming more susceptible.
And I think it makes people worse people. I think when you take away people's choices and their ability to be moral, they become worse people, and they don't care about each other as much as they would otherwise.
I just finished that off really quick. Sorry.
Nicely done.
Woo.
Have you ever read, this is another book that I'm going to recommend to our readers. You should read A Clockwork Orange or see the movie. No. Stanley Kubrick, amazing director. But there's another book by G.K. Chesterton, which is my favorite book by him, called The Ball and the Cross. And it's about an anarchist and a Catholic fighting. I thought of it because of this conversation. It's about an anarchist and a Catholic fighting each other across the countryside in Scotland, and the whole society is trying to get them to stop fighting. And the point of the book is that the two people who believe in something and are willing to fight over it have more in common and are better people than the people who are just trying to suppress the conversation and not let the conflict happen. And I love that book. I think it's a genius work. I love everything that G.K. Chesterton wrote, but that's my favorite of his.
I've never read that one.
The Ball and the Cross. Recommend.
I'm going to have to put that on my list because G.K. Chesterton is one of the most brilliant storytellers. His mind was never ceased to have creativity in it.
He's amazing.
I always do this. I always blank. His mystery, the priest that sold...
Father
Brown. We have a huge volume at home. My wife loves reading the Father Brown. She'll read a few out loud to me. And I'm like, how does he come up with this? It's unbelievable. His intellect.
Yeah, he was great. He was one of my favorite writers. I think I've read most of what he's written at this point.
I have one more question to pose for you because I was pondering when I was thinking about this conversation I want to have on my doubts that anarchy, in your sense, not the Fox News portrays, riots in the streets. I forgot how it came to mind, but it hit me. In the 1880s, we were probably for the 19th century, we were relatively in a laissez-faire, free society. But we lacked a lot, as in today. If you compare to today, the government didn't run healthcare. Everything was pretty much free.
There really wasn't. There weren't government police in London until I think 1870 or sometime around then. No government police before then. It's interesting.
So that sounds to me like a pretty awesome society. But when I think back, wow, they didn't have healthcare, they didn't have air conditioning. I can name all these luxuries that I enjoy now. Yeah. But the state is more coercive. Would I trade all? I feel like today's argument, if I present we used to be free 100 years ago, someone's gonna argue well, look at all these amazing things that we have. But then, I don't know. I think I would trade a lot of luxuries to be free. And the other argument, I love Civil War history, and sometimes I'll talk to someone who's very much a Southern apologist or just has family that came from the South. And one of their biggest arguments against slavery are it wasn't that bad. I'll say, the poor whites in the South were a lot worse off economically than the slaves. And I was but they were free.
Yeah.
Like, can you put a price on human freedom? Like, sure, your economic means kind of suck, but you're free. You have agency. The slaves, the blacks, had no agency. So I don't care if they were fed 3 times a day and only worked an 8-hour day.
Absolutely.
I'd rather be the poor white who's 15 hours and might eat once a day.
Yeah.
It's the same argument. Like, I'd rather be free.
Yeah.
But I don't know your take on that.
Well, I think that, technology has advanced since then. And so I don't know if you want to credit government institutions for creating all the technology that makes our lives better now. And I think if you look at the data, it's the being able to be risen out of poverty decreasing is because of capitalism. It's not because of government intervention. And probably things would have advanced a lot faster without the government intervention. People always like to point out like the environmental dangers of the Industrial Revolution and how all the buildings in London were covered in soot and it was just black. Everyone was getting black lung and how terrible it was. And that's true. That was all terrible. But I like to think about like, what if the EPA had existed then? Like, would we have been able to advance past that point? Would we have been able to get past the really dirty coal plants and move on to cleaner forms of energy if we had said, no, you just can't pollute. There's no polluting allowed, and had a regulation in place. I think you sometimes need to go through these transitional periods to get to a better place. And I worry about that now, where government is holding back innovation because of all these regulations, where I think the environment is something that rich people can afford to care about. Poor people don't care about the environment. They want to put food on the table. Rich people care about the environment. So in a sense, the faster you're able to get everybody rich, the better your environment's going to be. And I think capitalism is the thing that gets people rich fastest. And I worry about putting up roadblocks in people's way that then stop that development from happening as quickly as it could. And then we get into a place where people are voluntarily protecting the environment because they can afford to.
Yeah, I mean, the major polluters of the world are India and China. And they're in catch-up right now. Obviously, we're pretty good in the U.S. despite, I think our biggest polluter is the DOD, the government.
Yeah.
But, I forgot what I was going with that. On the anarchy side of things. No, Murray Rothbard. So you're a big fan of Murray Rothbard.
He's the one who got me over the hump because I was a minarchist, like a Robert Nozick kind of. You need a night watchman state kind of.
That's
person.
where I am. I'm a
that's where I was,
word,
and then I read some Murray Rothbard, and he convinced me. Basically, my hesitation was, well, what if someone gets together a military and they take over? What if someone puts together a group of a militia and they take over and become a military dictatorship? What's to stop that from happening under anarchy? And I don't have an answer to that. But I also don't have an answer to what's to stop the military we have now from taking over. Like, the president could get the top generals and say, you know what? I'm going to be a dictator now. Military's behind me. I'm taking over. There's really nothing preventing that from happening right now.
Sure.
It could happen. So it could happen in both cases. But in an anarchist society, you would have competing governments, or not really governments, but competing agencies trying to stop that from happening. Because if someone takes total control, then they're out of their business. So it's like, the Coke and Pepsi thing. Coke doesn't want Pepsi to get too big. Pepsi doesn't want Coke to get too big. They kind of keep each other down a little bit. And I think that's what you would have with kind of defense agencies and things. Like, nobody wants anyone to get too powerful, and they're all going to try to tear each other down to a certain extent to prevent that from happening. Whereas now, when you have a monopoly on violence with the police and the military, there's nothing to stop them from taking over.
Interesting. Well, I guess I feel like this wasn't as debate-ish as I wanted it to make it. It was more me casting my doubts and giving you the platform.
Were my answers satisfactory to you?
They were good. I think making the argument for anarchy is important because it helps pull us as a society. I feel like the government just constantly grows. I can't find that's my biggest fear of government. Like, no matter what, if I institute a good liberal republicanism, it's going to grow. So there has to be some voices that make strong arguments for the other side that pull us back.
Well, like I said, I'm not that interested in having this debate with people like you who are already minarchists because we're so far away from both of those cases. Like, some people use the analogy of a train. We're all on the train together. We're going in the same direction towards less government, more freedom. If you want to get out 3 stops from now and I want to get out 5 stops from now, that's fine. We can get along for the time we're on the train together. And once we get to your night watchman state that you want, then I'll come to you and say, hey, we need to go further, and try to convince you in that case. But until that time, I think we can just, keep going in the same direction and working together to make America a freer place and the world a freer place.
Cheers to that.
Cheers.
That was fun. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I already finished mine. So I was trying to get to the bourbon.